Paul was born in Bangladesh and has lived there ever since the partition of British India. Paul's family owned a bakery in Dhaka and had a pet Bengal tiger named Tony. Tony was 5 years old and Paul knew him since he was 14. Paul had a bicycle that he would train Tony to ride. Whenever Paul went to school, he talked about how talented Tony was, but the other boys wanted to see proof. Since at this time only the rich had cameras, Tony knew that he had to show them himself. The other boys told Paul that there was going to be a bicycle racing tournament and that if he wanted them to believe them, then his tiger, Tony, is able to bike. So Paul started to prepare Tony for this event. Paul told Tony that they both needed to work hard in order for them to see the result that they wanted. Paul started out by coming to the zoo every day after school and bringing his bike. Tony knew how to ride a bike, but the problem that Tony had was his endurance. Paul knew how to fix this since Paul participated in a few bike races before and his endurance was superb. Paul started out this training by telling Tony to bike over the hilly hills and then go to the curvy river. Tony was doing good so far and it seemed like it was going to be a breeze. Paul then told Tony that he had to then go through the jungle and then go to the bank. Tony started biking and soon he was near the jungle. Tony started to become winded, but Paul was riding beside him, cheering him on. Tony made it to the jungle and started to go through it. Tony saw a variety of animals in the forest, such as snakes, monkeys, other tigers, and lots of bugs. Tony felt winded again, but Paul said that if he gave up then he would just be like these other tigers, too lazy to ride a bike. So Tony pushed on and made it out of the jungle and into the slums of the big city of Dhaka. Tony was overwhelmed by all the smells and impoverished people of the street. This was Tony's first time out of the zoo and Paul knew that it made him uncomfortable, but he still encouraged him to keep going. Tony's legs were becoming sore, he hadn't known that this endurance trip was straining him and that he'd soon feel that he was going to be snapped like a twig. Paul saw this and quickly gave Tony a pep talk on how far Tony's gone and that he'd be just giving up if he stopped now. Tony made it to the bank and finally had time to rest. Paul gave Tony a lot of water and a protein bar. Paul told Tony that this was just going to be the start of his training and Tony was devastated. However, he knew that this was needed in order for Tony to be able to stand a chance against the other competitors at the Grand Biking Tournament. Tony knew that he couldn't dare to let Paul down since Paul had raised him ever since he was a cub. Paul was practically his father and Tony wasn't going to take the loss today. Tony was going to push forward and win that competition with a hard-working attitude. After reaching the bank and taking a break, Paul told Tony that Tony, needed to take a diet since the food Tony was eating made him tired and lacking his full potential. Paul brought Tony to the local grocery store and there they bought food that Tony was going to eat to become fit with. Paul chose a lot of protein and low amounts of fat and not carbohydrates. Tony soon incorporated this diet later and Paul had another assignment for Tony to do. Paul told Tony that his next activity was to bike from the bank to the call centers west. Tony was disgruntled because of the fact that the call centers were far and were shrouded in mystery because of the Hindus living there. Since Paul was Muslim, tension was strenuous. Tony biked across a river with Paul behind him for support. Tony was close to the Jakarta jails, a place where criminals are treated horribly and were the scene of several atrocities during the Great Bengal Tiger War of 1889. Tony was feeling uncomfortable near the Jakarta jails and told Paul that he couldn't go any further, but Paul knew that Tony was just feeling lazy and told him that this slacking behavior will cost them the tournament. Tony knew this and felt guilty and kept biking. Tony was sore on every muscle in his Bengal tiger body, but he still persevered. As Tony and Paul reached the western call centers near one of the complex borders of India and Bangladesh, they saw 30 Hindu nationalists and Tony's instinct overridden his common sense. Tony suddenly leapt out of his bike and assaulted the 30 nationalists. Tony bit off the arm of 10 Hindu nationalists and killed 3, the rest left unscathed. The Hindu nationalists vowed vengeance in the form of participation in the biking race and then left west. Paul wasn't happy or angry, but he knew that Tony was losing valuable time to train. Tony and Paul hopped back onto their bikes and started their route back to home. Paul knew that soon the sun would set and that his father and mother would beat him with the family whip. Paul told Tony that they would need to hurry back to the zoo, which was both Paul and Tony's home, before the sun would set, or they would be in big trouble. Tony and Paul biked as fast as they could across the river and through the jungle. When they reached the bank they were tired, but due to today's training, Tony and Paul had the abilities to keep going, and soon they reached the zoo. Tony and Paul had arrived before sunset and no one noticed that they had been drenched in sweat and blood. Paul gave Tony a bath and soon he bathed himself. Tomorrow was going to the day that the bicycle tournament was going to be occurring, and Paul was confident that Tony was going to be first place. Paul and Tony dreamt good dreams that night. The next day, Paul and Tony biked to the school for the competition. Paul saw that the Hindu nationalists were competing and Tony was amped up for the win that was going to ensue. The race was to the Bangladesh National Museum. The race started out clean without any tricks or any foul play. However, it wasn't long before the Hindu nationalists to pull some dirty tricks from their sleeves. They attempted to crash into Tony intentionally, but Tony easily maneuvered the bikes as a result of his training yesterday. Tony biked as hard as he could and soon made it past the leading biker, the boys that disregarded Tony's ability to bike. Tony then made it to the National Museum and was congratulated by Paul and the other children at school. The boys who doubted Tony apologized to Paul and decided to kick the remaining Hindu nationalists back west.